Welcome. I'm Renée Fleming with you from Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining me today for the pilot episode of Music and Mind Live. In recent years, I've had the privilege of meeting scientists and therapists around the world, and my passion for the intersection of health and the arts has only grown. It began with my position as artistic advisor at the Kennedy Center and an impromptu meeting with Dr. Francis Collins at a dinner, where I asked him why there was so much research on neuroscience and music and whether or not we might create a platform for this research at the Kennedy Center. 3 fruitful years have enlightened and delighted our audience, and I wanted to bring these fascinating stories to you now because more than ever in my lifetime, we cannot take our connection for granted. Which brings me to today's guest, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who served as the 19th Surgeon General in the United States between 2014 and 17. He addressed serious issues such as opioid addiction, e-cigarette use among youth, and a topic of special urgency today, loneliness. He's here to speak with us about his new best-selling book titled Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. Before I bring Dr. Murthy online, a request to please submit your questions in the comments section for those of you watching on Facebook. We'll answer some of them at the end of the interview and share your name and where you're from. We'd love to hear from all of you. And now for a reminder of the outpouring of creativity we've witnessed around the world despite a stay-at-home lockdown. It's music to my ears, beginning with me and Yevgeny Kissin, who was in Prague. Good afternoon, Dr. Murthy, and thank you so much for joining us. Okay, firstly, where are you and who are you with?
Well, it's good to see you, Renee, after a long time. I'm glad that we're
Yes.
together, even if it's virtually. And I am speaking to you from Miami, Florida. This is actually where I grew up, even though it's not where I'm based. I'm usually based in Washington, D.C. And I'm here with my wife, my 2 kids who are 3 and 2, my mother, my father, my sister, my grandmother, and my brother-in-law, and 2 cats.
Oh my goodness, that's fantastic. You're definitely not lonely. I
It's
looked,
chaotic, but it's okay.
yes, it's a good chaos. I looked up the definition of healer, and beyond curing medical disease and injury, I found someone who can alleviate distress or anguish, a transference of energy working at a deep level. In an era when power, money, celebrity, and a sharp tongue seem to dominate our airwaves, you possess an incredible warmth and an ability to touch people with words and a message beyond anything I've ever witnessed. So we met when I interviewed you with Dr. Francis Collins a few years ago, and we discussed the power of meditation and the arts as a source of healing, and also the importance of empathy. But first, I've got to ask you how you managed to time your book so perfectly. It was clearly meant to be.
Huh. Renee, I must say, when you were describing what you saw as the definition of a healer, somebody who can relieve anguish and bring comfort, I actually thought of you because
Uh,
that is what you do for so many people through the beauty of your music. So, but I appreciate those kind words. If you had told me a year ago when I was writing this book that we would be in the midst of this pandemic and physically distanced from each other and struggling to maintain connection to one another, I wouldn't have thought that that would be the case, but yet here we are. And the reason that I wrote about it, though, a year ago is because even before this pandemic, we were struggling with a deep well of loneliness, not just in the United States, but in many countries around the world where governments have found, as they've studied this issue, that double-digit percentages of their populations admit to being lonely. And not only is loneliness common, but we're finding increasingly that it's consequential for our health. And I was finding that behind so many of the stories I heard all across America of substance use disorders and addiction, behind the stories of violence and concerns about depression and anxiety and chronic illness, were these deeper threads of loneliness that were often contributing to illness. But conversely, I found that social connection was an extraordinary resource that I hadn't thought about as much in my own work doctoring. I had thought about medicines as part of my toolbox and medical technology is beneficial, but I hadn't quite appreciated how deeply healing human connection can be.
it's helpful to me when thinking about what drives us to think of evolution. So for me, fear was one of the emotional remnants of evolution that was plaguing to me, and really in the form of stage fright more than anything else, and adrenaline, which was not my favorite hormone, I have to say. And I was clearly confusing the audience with Tyrannosaurus Rex or Simon Cowell. And if loneliness is a vestige of evolution, I love that you talked about the purpose, that it actually had a positive purpose.
Yeah, and this is so important to understand because if you don't understand that loneliness is a natural signal, then you see it as evidence that you're broken, that you're deficient in some way. And I don't say that just theoretically. I say that because that's what I experienced also as a child. That in elementary school, I was profoundly lonely, not because I didn't want to be with other people, but because I was so shy, painfully shy, that it was hard to actually go up to other kids and introduce myself and just enter into conversation. And so going to school every day was a scary experience. I felt this pit in the bottom of my stomach each day when my mother pulled up in front of the school. But the scariest part of the day was actually lunchtime, walking into that cafeteria and wondering if there would be anyone to sit next to. So this is very, very, it is very personal to me. It's something I feel very viscerally. But what's telling is that I never told my parents about my loneliness growing up, even though I was completely confident about their unconditional love for me. And that's
Hmm.
because of this shame that surrounds loneliness that makes us think that something's wrong with us if we're lonely. So the evolutionary piece is critical because when here's what is so important to understand about it. Thousands of years ago, when we were hunter gatherers, we really relied on each other for our safety and survival in very tangible ways. So, for example, we would take turns around the fire at night, making sure that predators weren't approaching the group. We would share our food supply so that none of us would on our own starve, which often happened when single hunter gatherers were out there. And we also helped with childcare and with the other activities of daily living. That was so powerful, that connection, that when we were separated from our tribe, our chances of survival immediately dropped. And our body knew that. And so it sent up a flare in the form of loneliness. And that told us that it was time to quickly find our tribe again. Now, because we were under threat in that state, a stress state physiologically was triggered in our body so that we were ready to prepare to fight or to flee if necessary. In the short term, that stress can be helpful. It can motivate you to run faster, to look more clearly, to find, your tribe again. It can push you. The problem is when that stress state lasts for a long period of time. And this is where it's very analogous to hunger or thirst. Hunger or thirst are signals our body sends us, just like loneliness, when we are missing something we need for survival. And in this case, food, water, relationships, all essential for survival. In the case of hunger or thirst as well, if those go on for too long, not being filled, then we will run into serious health problems. And the same is true with loneliness, where chronic loneliness leads to a chronic stress state in our body, which can put us at risk for greater inflammation, which in turn can raise our risk for heart disease and other chronic illnesses.
I love this notion that it's a warning like hunger or thirst. And in other words, one can take action, that's a sign that we need to reach out. We need to somehow connect with family or friends. I mean, because that's kind of a positive sign in a way. But I was also very shy as a child and as actually as a young adult as well. And so it's hard. One thinks you become more and more reserved. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. So we're going to talk about a little bit later some of the differences between some of these various states. And you've spelled them out so beautifully. One of the things I think that was interesting is that what prompted you to kind of look into this even more when you were Surgeon General was the fact that teachers were reaching out to you and saying that they were concerned about the isolation of young people, having possibly to do with social media, with not reaching out, with being able to always turn to the phone. What are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. This was a theme that came up again and again. Whenever loneliness would surface in conversation, the very first question I would get about it, the most common question was, is it because of technology? And this was coming from teachers and also from parents who were seeing their kids using technology so often and were wondering, is this making them more connected or less
Mhm.
connected? And when it comes to tech, the answer to that question is somewhat nuanced. It's not that technology is good or bad. It's how we use it that determines whether it strengthens our connection or worsens our connection. So when I was small, for example, if I wanted to connect with my grandparents or my cousins in India, I had to write a letter to them on these blue aerograms that we would get from the post office. And I would dutifully write in whatever space we had available. It would take 2 weeks to get to India and 2 weeks for them to send me a reply back. These days I can video conference with family members there. And in that way, technology can be very helpful. If we use technology to find friends in a city that we're visiting so that we can meet up with them offline, that can be empowering. If we're also the member of a minority group or a group that does not have many people, who are like us, in our immediate vicinity, and we use online communities to find other people who have shared experiences, that can be powerful too. Where we run into trouble with technology is when one of several things happens. One is when we are spending so much time in front of our screens that it is crowding out in-person interaction in our life. The second is when we are allowing technology to creep into our conversations. So, for example, and I'm not proud of this, but I have been guilty of having conversations with friends on the phone while I also, inevitably find myself scrolling through my inbox, refreshing my social media feed, Googling a question that popped up into my head, checking out the score in the basketball game in the background on the TV. And I convinced myself that I can do all this because I can multitask. But the science is very clear that we cannot multitask. And in fact, we task switch very rapidly when we think we're multitasking. So the truth is that the more we allow technology to intrude on our conversation, the lower the quality of that conversation becomes. And the irony is that studies clearly show that both people feel the
Mm.
impact on quality. But there's a third and perhaps more insidious, perhaps the most concerning way that I worry about technology impacting our relationships. And that actually has to do with how it affects our self esteem. We already knew long before smartphones were on the scene or social media arrived that we lived in a culture of comparison in the modern world. We looked at the car we drove and compared it to our neighbors. Compared our houses and jobs and incomes and clothes. But what has happened with the advent of social media, it has dramatically accelerated that culture of comparison. And so just by scrolling through someone's feed on social media, you are looking at elements of their lives that are often perfectly curated. But what you end up doing is comparing what are effectively people's best days and best moments with your average days and average moments. And you can often feel like you're coming up short. I worry about this particularly for young people who are receiving so often these messages through both traditional media and social media that they are not enough. They're not thin enough. They're not good looking enough. They're not smart enough. They're not popular enough. These are often paired with an ad to sell them a product to fill that deficiency. But regardless, the message that you are not enough continues to pound our children, which is really unfortunate because it turns out that when our self esteem erodes, as it often does when we're chronically lonely or when we feel we're not enough, that makes it harder for us to build stronger connections with other people because we start approaching people not from a place of abundance and confidence, not with knowing that we can bring something of value to the conversation, but we start approaching others seeking validation, trying to be who we think they want us to be or who we think society wants us to be. And so this is what we have to guard against when we use technology. We have to ensure that we are using it in ways that accelerate in-person connection, that strengthen our ability to have high quality conversations. But we have to guard against it invading our conversations, crowding out our in-person interactions, and leading to the kind of comparison that can ultimately erode our connection with self, which is a foundation for our connecting with others.
Yes, I find it really fascinating that you also brought clarity to the differences between loneliness, isolation, anxiety, and depression, and how they connect to each other and how they don't. Is there anything you can tell us about that?
Yeah, so it turns out that an objective a view of the number of people you have around you is what's conveyed by the term isolation. So loneliness, on the other hand, is a subjective term. Regardless of how many people you have around you, if you do not feel like you can be yourself with others, that people understand you, then that can become a lonely experience very quickly. This is what happens so often to college students who go away and are in a large group of new people on a campus. And you might think, well, how could they be lonely? Well, if you don't feel like, again, you can connect with people and be yourself, that can get lonely really fast.
I
So,
often had that thought walking the streets of New York and really
hmm,
thinking about what in a crowded city, there are surely many lonely people.
absolutely. And what's really interesting about loneliness and depression and anxiety is I think of loneliness as a great masquerader. And this is why it's so hard to see, why we look around the world and we think, gosh, maybe I'm the only one who's lonely. Because loneliness doesn't always look like somebody sitting in the corner of a room in the midst of a party while they're all alone. Loneliness can look like irritability and anger. It can look like withdrawal. It can look like depression. It can look like anxiety. And how it looks really depends on our own personalities and our circumstances. It's not to say that loneliness is the sole cause of all depression and all anxiety. That's not the case, but it can often contribute to both, and it can often mimic depression and anxiety. So that is where it becomes so relevant and so important to understand. The more I delved into loneliness, the more I started to see that so many of the situations I was encountering, both as Surgeon General, but also in the hospital as a doctor, had threads of loneliness that connected to them. I found even for patients who were struggling with depression, that strong social connection could often lift their mood and help them. The same was true for anxiety when I would find that strong social interactions and connection could help reduce people's overall level of stress and help address some of their anxiety as well. So we have to think about loneliness not just as a challenge, but also recognize that social connection is an extraordinary resource that we have, a source of healing, a performance enhancer, and an extraordinary source of fulfillment as well.
So recent discoveries date music and art back at approximately 40,000 years, and strengthening social ties within groups was needed for survival. And music is a human invariant. It's been with every culture that we know throughout history: singing, chanting, drumming, and dancing. And I know you love to dance. And you also play an instrument, which I think is so great. And the World Health Organization has found that the arts can affect the social determinants of health, including developing social cohesion and reducing social inequities. So, how does loneliness affect our health? I find the statistics really shocking that 20 to 30% of adults have a number of disorders and diseases and early deaths. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So this is really fascinating, and it helps to emphasize why loneliness is so important beyond being a bad feeling, is that people who struggle with loneliness seem to have worse health outcomes. In fact, loneliness is associated with an increased risk of heart disease and dementia and depression and anxiety. But what's also particularly interesting is about lifespan. So it turns out that people who are lonely seem to live shorter lives, and the mortality impact, the amount by which their life is shortened, is similar to the mortality impact we see with smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's greater than the mortality impact of obesity or sedentary living. I say that as someone who served as Surgeon General and came from an office that has spent decades addressing those three issues: smoking, obesity, and sedentary living. Yet it was not on my radar that loneliness could have consequences that were in the same ballpark, and that had to be an important, equally important part of our concern. So that is just how powerful the health impacts of loneliness can be. I think it's also important to recognize that at a time when we are struggling to find new medicines, new therapies to alleviate some of the conditions that are cropping up, that we cannot lose sight of the fact that our social connection with each other is an important tool for that healing. It's something that we should think about cultivating, and in our lives in general, but also as doctors and nurses, we should think about tracking and understanding whether or not our patients are connected, whether or not they have relationships that are meaningful to them in their lives, because that matters in driving the healthcare outcomes that we're all trying to achieve together.
So, in the pandemic, when so many people are stuck at home and sometimes alone, really not with others, can you prescribe for us for months now, what might we do? How might we take this into practice? Combating negative self-talk, and you talked about the 15 minutes. Give us your prescription.
Sure. So, COVID-19 has just been an extraordinary and painful experience for so many people around the world. But one of the hardest things about it, in addition to the great stress, the economic hardship, the direct health impact that so many of us and our loved ones may have gone through, as well as the uncertainty of the moment, in addition to all of that, it is the inability to see people physically in person, to touch, to hug, to just be face to face, that has been so challenging for so many of us. The reason is that in times of stress, what we typically do is we reach out to each other. We call a friend, we go and see somebody that we love, and that helps to reduce our overall level of stress. My concern is that if we do nothing differently, if we allow the physical distance to translate into social distancing, further deepening our loneliness, then we will incur what I think of as a social recession that will have consequences for our health and society that may be just as important as the economic recession that we may be faced with. But I think we can choose a different pathway. Instead of a social recession, I think we can choose the path of social revival. And the way we can do that is by using this moment to step back and to ask ourselves, what role do we want our relationships to play in our lives? Where do they actually fall in our priority list? And how do we want to recommit to those relationships? And we can start doing that right now, even though we can't see each other. So, for example, we can make it a point to spend 15 minutes a day reaching out to someone we love, whether that's by phone or video conference. It's a small amount of time, but when done consistently, it can make us feel good in the moment and serve as a lifeline to the outside world. The second thing we can do is to focus on the quality of our time with each other. So often we are multitasking when we're talking to friends and to loved ones. But if you've ever had the experience, I'm sure you have, Renee, but if you can recall what it's like to have a conversation with somebody when they're listening to you with their full attention, when they're present, fully present for you, when you're able to share openly with them, you know that that just feels incredible. It's the experience of being fully seen and heard, of being witnessed in a sense. And 5 minutes of fully present conversation like that can often be more powerful than a half hour of distracted conversation. So even if you can't spend a minute more with the people you love, if you make that time count by eliminating distraction when you're talking to others, that can be powerful. The third thing we can do is look for opportunities to serve. One of the things that I realized unexpectedly in the writing of this book was that service is a powerful antidote to loneliness. Because now that you understand the negative tendencies that form when we're chronically lonely, that elevated threat state, that shift of attention inward because we're worried about our safety, and that erosion of self esteem as we're chronically lonely and come to think that perhaps it's our fault, you can recognize that service is a way of short circuiting those mechanisms, because what it does is it shifts the focus from us to someone else in the context of a positive interaction. And it also reaffirms for us that we have value to bring to the world. And in the age of COVID-19, service does not have to look like going to volunteer at an organization in your community. It can look like calling a friend to see if they're okay, knowing that they may have been struggling with loneliness before. It can look like checking on a neighbor who may have a hard time getting to the grocery store because they're worried about their risk of illness. It could even look like calling up a friend who's a parent struggling to telework and homeschool their kids, just to offer to virtually babysit for 5 or 10 minutes so they can just sit down, take a moment, and take a deep breath. Service does not have to be complicated, but even when it's simple, it can be powerful in terms of how connected it makes us feel to others. There's one last thing that we can do, and that's to take moments for solitude. Solitude is an interesting and very, very important concept, because moments of solitude, when we are alone, but when we feel good, those are the moments when we ground ourselves, when we let the noise around us settle, when we recenter ourselves, and when we have a chance to reflect and
I
to
was
think.
surprised that you
Mhm.
mentioned that actually, because we don't think of alleviating loneliness with more alone time. But I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned how important solitude is and that we need that. And I also, I always think of being creative is very helpful. I mean, and also some kind of experience with nature. Meditation, I know, is something that you've talked about in the past as being extremely helpful.
Yeah.
Art, prayer, and it can really, gratitude is huge. It can be one of the 5 keys to happiness. And one quote I loved from your book, Susan Keen: the connection, and this is musical, between a reader writer or listener composer is like a feeling of the joining of souls, a shared experience,
Yes.
and one that connects both memory and emotion, which of course musical memory is the last to be with those patients who have dementia and Alzheimer's. And only human beings, I love this as well, get goosebumps from awe. Animals get goosebumps too, but only humans from awe. And that's something we want to feel awe more often somehow, don't we? So engaging with the arts can be very helpful in that respect.
It can be, and music is very powerful in this regard. One of the things that I found in the research for this book is that when we not only when we enjoy music, that can actually help bring calm and comfort and inspiration to our lives, which reduces our overall stress level. But when we do music together, either making music together or enjoying it together, that can often boost our endorphin levels significantly. In fact, a UK researcher who I spent some time working with, he said that if you want to build strong social connection, one of the most powerful things that you can do is to join a choir group, because there's
Mm.
something powerful about singing together in unison that actually boosts, turbocharges our endorphin increase. So I think the arts are so powerful. And I think, and as I've talked to so many people around the country about STEM and the importance of improving and increasing our focus on science, I worry that we have to make sure we're not leaving out the focus on arts, and recognize
Steam,
that,
yes, steam,
that
please.
exactly, that music and art are powerful tools for social connection as well as for our healing.
Well, I love that you said we're all in this together. So the outpouring at the beginning of the pandemic of goodwill that we witnessed everywhere, that, and especially in this country, the loss and the dropping of any kind of political divide was very moving to me. But you said that this is a very natural state for us to be helping others and to be working and cooperating in a group. Can you say something about that? I think that's brilliant.
Well, it is. And the thing is, there's a narrative that tells us that as human beings, that our true nature is to look out just for ourselves, it's to be self serving. I don't think that that's true. I think in times of crisis, you see what our true nature is, and you see people coming out to help each other. We saw this in 9/11 in the United States, when people came from all corners of the country to New York City to help rebuild and help support people who had lost their lives and their homes and their loved ones. But we see it now too during COVID-19, with the outpouring of support from neighbors supporting neighbors, from people coming forward to help those who cannot help themselves. And that's who we are ultimately as people. That's why this whole journey to build a more connected life and to build a more connected world, which is at the heart of why I began working on this subject in the first place. This is not an effort to transform us into something that we're not. It's an effort to return us to who we fundamentally are, which is
I love
beings that were made to connect with each other, that thrive when we're giving and receiving love. And the most tangible way we do that is through our relationships.
I love the quote from your book: "In giving, we receive, and in grasping, we lose." It's a beautiful quote. So I watched music therapists providing drumming circles for doctors and nurses as I visited various hospitals and really witnessed what caregivers do and how much they give. Right now, the commitment and that there is being asked of them, and they've got to be incredibly overwhelmed and surely burnt out. What do you say to them about resilience, how to feed themselves, how to continue on?
Well, it's been extraordinary just to see the heart and the compassion, the commitment that so many frontline workers have in our hospitals, and frankly, even outside our hospitals, and people who are working in grocery stores and as first responders in other settings who are out there putting themselves on the line to make sure that all of us have what we need. But there is a high level of burnout that comes with that work. And there's also a level of trauma that they experience as well, which can surface in the form of depression, anxiety, and post traumatic stress disorder, not just during the stressor, but even weeks, months afterward. And what I say to many of them, in addition to just thanking them for their work, and I've had the privilege of speaking to many of our frontline workers, is number one, I tell them that it's not selfish for them to put time aside for themselves, to reground themselves, to rest, not just physically, but also emotionally from that work. The second thing I try to remind them of is that it is at times like this, when we're undergoing such severe stress, that our relationships really matter. And what matters is not the quantity of time we have with people, but the quality. So even on the way home, if they're able to spend 5 minutes on the phone talking to a loved one, to share what they're going through openly and honestly, that can be enormously healing. And the last thing I tell them is that we have to pace ourselves. In medicine, and it was something I know about firsthand from my training days, that there can be a pressure internally and externally to just be on all the time and to never sort of let up on the gas.
Sounds
But
like performing.
yes, many of our cultures, professional cultures, have that attribute, but it's a recipe for perhaps short-term output, but long-term, it's a recipe for burnout. And that's part of the deeper culture that we have to change. So I think if we want to build sustainable careers for our doctors and nurses, but for our children and whatever career they go into, we have to make it okay to recognize your social needs, to focus on that solitude and that social connection that are essential for our overall well-being.
Well, I have to say, I love this notion too of singing in choirs and really signing up for any kind of online experience that one can find. And amateurs are also playing together on the street, 6 feet apart and maintaining their social distancing. I know it's really not terribly safe right now to sing in a choir together, since we definitely produce some kind of probably more air than others. So I want to thank you so much, Vivek. And I think we may have some questions from our viewers worldwide. And I'm going to try and see one right now. This is from, yes. Oh my gosh, there are tons of them. Here's a question for Dr. Murty from Daniel Leviton. Oh my gosh. There we go. Well, Daniel's going to be on the show soon talking about why we should engage with music, especially in this time. If you were Surgeon General today, what kind of evidence would you want to see that would spur you to recommend music to be used for therapeutic purposes, with the implication that it would be covered by insurance and Medicare? Great
Well, that's a
question.
great
Thank you,
question.
Daniel.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think many of us know intuitively that, and from even our own clinical experience, that music can be deeply healing for many patients, and it reduces the overall level of stress they experience. There's some basic science level data showing that it reduces stress hormones as well. But I think we have, I think, enough to fund pilot projects in this area so that we can start to gather data on clinical outcomes, both how people feel, qualitative outcomes, but also measurable outcomes in terms of how it impacts people's recovery from illness and even their, recurrence of illness. And I think we would need that, at a larger scale to be able to make the case that this should be covered by Medicare and Medicaid, which typically have high standards in terms of evidence thresholds. But I don't think that that's unattainable. And in fact, I think that what we have done, unfortunately, is we have discovered new technologies in medicine and new medications. Is at times I worry that we become fascinated with the new and we have forgotten about the old therapies, about being together, about enjoying music and art together, and about how healing those can be. So I think it's incumbent on us to make that a priority in our study and then to increasingly make that available for people because we need to be using every tool in our toolbox to help people heal across the country and around the world.
Yes. Okay. From Jessica in Texas. For some, the pandemic has initiated a fight or flight response that causes us to shut down. How can one combat the feeling of being unproductive, even when it comes to making music? This is from Frisco, Texas.
Hmm.
Jessica.
Well, Jessica, thank you for that question. And one of the reasons I'm so glad you asked that is that you're not alone. Number one, there are a lot of people who are wondering why it is that they're feeling less quote unquote motivated, or why it's harder for them to get tasks done or to pay attention to the 7 hours of Zoom telework conferences that they have going on. And there's a reason for this that I want to be very clear about, which is that what we're going through is a form of collective trauma. And that trauma brings a great deal of stress with it. And stress manifests in different people in different ways. Some people become irritable when they're stressed out, other people become sullen and withdrawn. For many of us, it will affect our focus and even the quality of our sleep. And so, in this moment, it's important to be forgiving with yourself and to recognize that if you're not being as productive as you want or as engaged as you want in your work or in your art, that there's a reason for that. It's because you're experiencing something far deeper than we can appreciate right now. In the years to come, this will be written about in the history books. Our children will learn about this moment and how extraordinarily tumultuous it was for all of us. But when we're living in the midst of it, it can be hard to see.
Yes, I agree. It is something that we're going to take with us forever. Hopefully, if we all survive this. And there's been so much loss already, for which my heart absolutely breaks. It started with Italy for me, and really thinking about the seat of classical music for voice being from northern Italy. So much suffering. We have a good question for me from Ioana in Romania. Loneliness is sometimes associated with shyness. What is your advice for a young artist to overcome this shyness? I actually have a good answer for that question because I had to do it myself, and I did it by observing my friends and observing people that I saw who were very confident. And I realized that they weren't perfect. I assumed that I needed to be shy and needed to be kind of reserved and anxious because I wasn't ever going to be good enough. So I just started to learn by observing other people. Do you have an answer to that question, Dr. Murty?
Well, I think that's a beautiful strategy as well. And one thing I would just add on that I found helpful is to build your confidence by focusing initially on relationships where it's easier to connect with others. So if you have one or two good friends and you spend time with them, don't feel bad that those are the only two friends you might be spending time with, but just try to remember what that relationship teaches you, which is that you have something valuable to bring to a relationship, that you can be yourself in settings and it feels good to be yourself. And just also remember that even though you might feel shy when you're approaching others, and it might seem like everyone is confident and doesn't have any issues, a lot of people are scared inside when they're approaching new people. They may not show it so easily, but a lot of people are scared. And sometimes when you go up to someone and you're just honest about how you're feeling, if you say, "Hey, I'm kind of nervous right now, but I just want to, to come say hi or to talk to you," that kind of honesty, that kind of vulnerability can be disarming for people. And you'll often find that you'll not only feel better when you're honest, but you invite other people to be open about their struggles, their fear, their shyness as well.
Yes. From Aliyah in Georgia, Dr. Vivek Murthy, how do you envision the severe stress and required social distancing of the pandemic could alter our social landscape in the long term?
Well, I think at least until we get a vaccine, which could be, a year away, potentially more, hopefully less. But I think until we get a vaccine, we will likely not see large crowded events taking place. We'll also likely still see precautions in terms of people being asked to keep distance from others and to wear masks. The masks is very important as a public health strategy, but also very consequential for our social interactions. Because as human beings, we evolved over thousands of years, not just to process the content of someone's words, but also the facial expressions, the tone of their voice, their body language. All of that goes into how we interpret our communication with somebody. And not being able to see a good portion of their face is something I think that may very well impact how we interact with each other. So I do think that this will have a significant impact on our social connection and interactions. But what I hope is that we will come out of this with a much deeper appreciation for just how valuable and precious those interactions are, not just with our family and friends, but even with strangers. I think now so many times about how nice it would be to go sit in a coffee shop with total strangers and just to be surrounded by other people. I do hope that that day will come back soon.
Things that we took completely for granted. It's true. From Anne in Alaska, timely question. Greetings from Anchorage. Can you please comment, reflect on recent reports about the concern for returning to in-person group singing? I work with a chorus program for those living with dementia, their care partners, and community volunteers. I worry about when we will be able to gather together again to sing. So do I. Please give us some thoughts on that, Dr. Murphy.
Yeah, so this is challenging because we know that even with talking, that we can expel viral particles and they can linger in the air for, up to 13 minutes. And so singing is an even more forceful way of expelling those viral particles. So, this is difficult because I recognize it's hard to sing with a mask on. But we know that when you're singing and somebody else does not have protection, whether that's a plexiglass barrier or whether that's a negative pressure room or whether that's something else that they're wearing to protect themselves, that it can actually put them at risk. So I don't have a great answer for when we can
Yeah.
resume group singing, like in choirs, because right now it's unfortunately risky in terms of spreading the virus in the environment around you.
Sigh. I hope, yes, I'm longing for that day as well. This is from Wendy Sue, who is our friend from Novartis. There is evidence that stress can dysregulate the immune system, resulting in a more pro inflammatory milieu. What are your thoughts about music or art therapy potentially reducing stress, thus potentially altering the immune system? Yes, perhaps if this is the case, perhaps we can measure these changes in patients with neurological autoimmune diseases. Thoughts?
Yes, well, Wendy Sue, that's a great question. And that is, I think, what would be very interesting research to do. That's some of the kind of research I think we need to continue to build on to make the case, which I think is already increasingly being made, that music has a measurable impact on our body. Now, some of that research already exists. We have seen that certain stress hormones do, in fact, reduce in people who are listening to music. And what we would be particularly interesting is to show that this is true in different disease states where we know the inflammatory response is a key part of the pathogenesis of that illness or the development of that disease. Uh, this is where actually research and governmental involvement becomes so important, because as much as we may fund research from a private, philanthropy perspective, particularly in the United States, there's no comparison to what the federal government can fund in terms of the scale of research. And when the government decides, okay, we are going to invest in certain areas because we think they are worth investigating, they have promise, you can really move mountains and shift entire fields. And that's why I think that, Renee, the collaboration you've had with Francis Collins at NIH has been so important and valuable, because this is one of those places where scientists have to not just be scientific, but they have to be creative and open minded in thinking not just about what's going to help people heal tomorrow, but what do we need to be thinking about next year and in 5 years and 10 years? What are the arsenals of healing that we need to open and unleash and make available to people. I think music increasingly is becoming one of those. So I think this is our time to deepen our investment in research so we can understand how to deploy that healing source as quickly and as broadly as possible.
That is amazing. I'm so happy to hear you say that. And first of all, the fact that you acknowledge, I believe that science is incredibly creative because one is imagining what can be, how life can be better. And when you think of what's happened in the last century for us in terms of our health and what you and all of these disciplines have wrought for us, I'm incredibly grateful. It's extremely moving to me. And as a musician, of course, that's what we do. We really understand the creative process, and so that's why I feel like I get along so well with you, and I'm so grateful. So one last question: how important are intergenerational opportunities in combating loneliness in so many populations who live with loneliness regularly? How do we create more opportunities for this in our learning spaces and our healthcare system?
Yeah, so I actually think that intergenerational approaches in a variety of settings, in education, in healthcare, as well as just more broadly in society, I think are incredibly important. And for a couple of reasons. One is because I think older generations obviously have so much that they can bring to younger generations. We've seen in interesting experiments that have been run in the UK, programs that have allowed, for example, young college students to live with senior citizens, that there's tremendous benefit that both parties get. We've seen in Baltimore, Maryland, through the Experience Corps, that when you take older citizens and you bring them into schools to help tutor young kids, but where the kids can also teach the older people about technology, that ends up being such a mutually beneficial type of relationship. So I think intergenerational initiatives are important because they help strengthen the connective tissue that needs to run through society. But there's one last thing I worry about a bit, for which I think intergenerational initiatives are so important. I worry that in modern society, the message that we're sending to older people is that they just matter less as they get older, because we live in a society that prides youth and associates youth with vigor. And as people get older, and I hear this so many times, and I've heard it so often from patients directly and from people as I've visited folks around the country, I've found many people feel like they become less relevant, that they're just obstacles in the way of their family, that they're consigned to institutions to live in because their family doesn't want to bother with them. And it breaks my heart when I hear that, because it contrasts with what my parents so often described to me that they saw when they were growing up in India, which was not a perfect society by any stretch of the imagination, but one where elders were actually placed at the center of life, where they were venerated, where they were respected, where experience was seen as a sacred commodity, and where their input was sought on all decisions. And I think about that, and I think that it's important for us to make sure that as people age in our society, that we remind them that we still care for them, that we still respect them, that we still believe that they have value because of their experiences and their age. And I think that's why intergenerational engagement can be so powerful, because they can see and feel that appreciation from children when they interact with them, and they can see how they're helping other people when they engage in service initiatives in their community. Look, I know that we're at the end of our time, so I just wanted to share one last thought here, which is that as we think about all of these subjects that we've talked about today, whether it's about kids or whether it's about older people, the importance of connection, I think, could not be more clear. The importance of cultivating relationships, of investing in our human connection with each other, I think could not be more urgent than a moment like this. You know, when I think about my 3-year-old and my 2-year-old, and I think about what I worry about for the future. I worry that I won't always be there to protect them, that my wife won't be either. What we're going to rely on, what all of us need for our children, is a world that's compassionate, is to know that when they go out and make a mistake, that they'll be met with kindness, with somebody who's willing to help them up when they stumble. That's what we want to know, but that can only happen if we live in a world where love, compassion, and kindness are not seen as sources of weakness or being
Mm.
soft, but they're seen for what they are, which is extraordinary sources of power and a source of strength that we all need more of in our daily lives. Building a connected life is about building a society that's powered by love. And if we teach our children that what gives them worth as a human being is not their ability to acquire power and wealth and fame, but rather their ability to be compassionate, to be kind, and to give and receive love, then we will have given them a foundation for self-worth. We will have made it easier for them to connect with others. And that, I think, is at the heart of what it means to live a truly connected life.
Thank you, Vivek. Honestly, we can take those words and really contemplate the things about the things that you've said on this in this talk, because we have time to do that now. This is a gift, isn't it? In a way, I mean, it's very challenging and it's hard, but this is the time that we can stop and regroup and think, how do we want the future to be, and how do we want to spend our lives? Thank
That's
you
right.
for this gift of your time and for the book, which I highly recommend. And I wish you well, and I hope I get to hear you speak often and on a regular basis. So thank you so much, Vivek.
Thank you so much, Renee. So nice to be with you and so wonderful to talk about this subject with you as well. I hope to see you soon.
Thank you. You too. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and general note to thank our artistic and health partners who've shared today's event across Facebook. I hope you enjoyed our first episode of Music and Mind Live, and I'll be with you every Tuesday at 5 o'clock via my Facebook page, Renee Fleming Music, or the Kennedy Center YouTube channel. Episodes will be available to view later, though, if you missed the live webinar. To stay in the loop, please sign up for my newsletter at my Facebook page or at my website, reneefleming.com. Next week, I'll be joined by Doctors Julene Johnson, who published a major study about the benefits of singing in a chorus, something to look forward to, and Charles Lim, who studied the brain to understand creativity and the art of improvisation, both at UC San Francisco. We'll also have Sunil Iyengar with news from the National Endowment for the Arts, an exciting development. And in upcoming episodes, we'll be covering topics that includes using music at home with children. Hopefully Vivek can listen to that one. And how and why to engage with music now. And I'll be welcoming the world famous Deepak Chopra and best-selling author Dan Levitin, among other great guests. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you again, Vivek.
Thank you.